Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of interesting points that I want to touch on in that. Uh, so two things really. One is, the conversation with the deaf community, with the user group of this. I think it's such a great story about, kids and media and literacy. When you started doing captioning, what was that conversation like to really get the most out of the experience? Because I think that as people who can hear, we take for granted that we can hear both speech, but that we can read
Hmm.
context through sound is something that we don't really have to think about. But to be able to take what's happening on the screen, the audio portion of what's happening in a media, and turn that into text that gives the same experience. What was that process like for closed captioning in the early days to do that translation?
It was pretty fascinating because we really were founded by linguists, people who really knew deaf education, sign language, and the transfer of sign to English, which is very different. And we started off with a belief that, especially on programs for deaf kids, we needed to edit heavily. We needed to use the term, dumb down the language that was being spoken on screen and slow it down because the perceived wisdom among educators of deaf kids at the time in the 70s and 80s was that they couldn't keep up. And so we spent a tremendous amount of time taking more complicated sentences and creating noun, subject, noun, verb, subject, just straight, very easily digestible language. And not long after I joined in, we were getting pushback from deaf parents, deaf educators, deaf policymakers who were saying, why are you editing so heavily? How are we ever going to learn the language when you keep changing what is being said to what you think deaf kids need? And I'll say today, it feels like it was overnight. We changed, and everyone in the business changed from heavily edited captions to verbatim, word for word. And first of all, hey, that's great. Look at how much less time we have to spend editing. That saved us time and money. But also the perception of why are we being paternalistic here? If a deaf kid has trouble understanding and comprehending, okay, rewind, watch again. It's a learning opportunity. And that has become the rule ever since. So our job translating what was being spoken became much more of almost a straight pipeline. Put on screen what is being said. And that became an interesting controversy when we started captioning some R-rated movies. We had some clients who said, even though that bad word was spoken, we want you to censor it in the captions. Oh, that was an interesting controversy. Shouldn't we be giving deaf people exactly the same thing that hearing people are getting? And to this day, you'll see that in automatic speech recognition. Some of those machine engines are tuned to replace the F word with F asterisk, 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 even though it's being spoken out loud. So the whole thing's come all the way around again. Now machines are censoring on the behalf of the people receiving it. But it was a great learning opportunity to better understand our job.
Mm-hmm. No, that's fascinating. That idea of censorship and changing the message. I think that's something we don't really think about. That when you can't, either because you don't speak the language or you can't hear what's being said, that the message can be interpreted for you by somebody that doesn't have that same perspective or experience. And that's really interesting. Did you have members of the deaf community working in the actual process? I know that seems like a strange question because if you can't hear it, how do you write it? But in the translation, did you have members of the deaf community working with you?
Yeah, from day one. In fact, much of this work was started by deaf people in the federal government. There was a commission on education of the deaf headed by a deaf professor named Frank Bowe. He was the one who pushed captioning so heavily. We were always guided. We always had advisory groups. We had staff members who were deaf. The diversity of deafness is also a wide range. So there's still people who have some hearing but need captions. And then today, everyone's watching captions and people with very good hearing. So yeah, we were always guided by the deaf community, and particularly this issue of censorship and verbatim absolutely was driven by the deaf community. And boy, can they spot errors when there were typos, when they could clearly tell that wasn't what they said. Oh, we would hear about it. So we had a long-standing, and every captioning company had long-standing advisory groups where these questions were explored. The verbatim question was chewed over by a lot of experts in the field, and we would sit and listen. You know, there's an expression in the disability community, nothing about us without us. And this was the exemplar of that. If we're creating something for deaf people, we better be sure they're involved in the process.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great saying.